Meeting will end in 10 minutes. Are we? Yes, we are on live.
Okay, so we'll start now. Yeah? Hello and welcome to everyone who is watching this online lecture today on behalf of the Students Federation of India. This online lecture is being held in the run-up to the Students Federation of India's 18th All India Conference, which will be held in Kozhikode, Kerala, between the 27th and the 30th of June this year. Now, our speaker for today is someone who needs little to no introduction. He's one of our own. But as these things go, I will give a formal introduction of our speaker today. We have Comrade Dr. Vijay Prashad. Comrade Vijay is a historian. He is a man, firstly, who wears many hats. So it's often difficult to do this with Comrade Vijay, but um, I'll give it a try. Comrade Vijay is a historian, he's an author, he's a journalist, he's the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and he is the editor of Leftward Books. Now, before we begin, the topic for today, on which Comrade Vijay has very kindly agreed to speak, is the new mood in the global south, BRICS and the challenge to neocolonialism. Um, as and when you have questions, comments, or queries, please drop them in the comment section wherever you're watching this, either on Facebook or on Instagram Live, and we'll take them up at the very end. So with that, Comrade Vijay, welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nikhil. It's great to be with you. Great to be with all of you, and congratulations as you go towards your conference. I've been busy recently writing a piece for the text you'll receive at the conference on sports. And, I've been doing this column on cricket recently. And sometimes I wish I could just talk about sports because what I've been writing about in this column is about a Cuban boxer who I greatly admire, won 3 gold medals in a row, but that's not what we're talking about today. Um, Today, we're talking about great changes taking place in the world, but also great changes that we have to learn not to exaggerate. I mean, while we're talking now, the conflict imposed on the Iranians by the Israelis really demonstrates the weakness of the world order. It's not so much that the global south has a new mood and so on, but also shows you what kinds of things cannot be done. It's not so much what the global south in its new aggressive or rather more confident form is able to do. It's what it can't do. That's, I think, important to register. Can't stop the genocide against the Palestinians, for instance. We have to register that. That's why I'm very cautious about how people use terms like multipolarity and so on. They don't appeal to me because I don't see it. I don't see multipolarity. Anyway, I'm going to try to offer, some schematic ways to understand the world order. And in order for that, I'm going to have 3 sections to this presentation. The first section is called 5 controls. The second section is called 3 propositions. And the third section is called 2 dialectics. Okay, 5, 3, 2. That's how we're going to go. For those who might recognize this, this is the old football formation, 5, 3, 2. So there we go. Five controls. First control is control over raw materials. Now, these 5 controls, control over raw materials, control over science and technology, control over financial systems, control over information, and control over weapons, were identified by Samir Amin, a great Egyptian Marxist, as the fundamental ways to grasp whether a country is in is in dominance in the world system or not. He said there's an interesting methodology to calibrate whether a country is in power. So he proposed these 5 controls. Looking into it, I think he was pretty accurate to identify these 5 areas of human life as a kind of methodology to gauge control. The first 3, which I'll go over, are now under contest. In other words, the global north, the Western countries, the advanced capitalist bloc, does not any longer control these fully. The last 2, it controls fully. So let's go over them. Control over raw materials. For a very long time, because of colonialism and neocolonial economic structures, the West continued to dominate the raw material extraction around the world, whether it was direct extraction, so it conducted coup d'etats against any independent country that wanted to nationalize raw materials, or it was control over the distribution systems, procurement, and so on. One way or the other, West controlled this entire system. In recent years, this has been challenged. It was challenged in the 1970s, with the attempt to build a new international economic order, didn't succeed. The only cartel that really succeeded was the oil cartel, OPEC. Didn't succeed, hadn't succeeded, but in recent years, countries have been able to push back against the control by Western countries, including large countries like Indonesia having a debate about whether they should export raw nickel or process it in country first. That itself is a debate around control over raw materials. Or Niger, which expelled the French and said that Niger itself would control its uranium. So, raw materials, that's under contest. Second, science and technology. No doubt about it, under contest. It is very clear that the Center for Science and Technology has shifted from the Atlantic world to China and other countries in Asia, including to some extent India, although India doesn't so much control a lot of its science and technology, but it has produced tremendous scientists and technologists, particularly in the recent period. But China definitely, without a doubt, in the lead here. It's really put the West under pressure. Huawei and companies like that building smartphones, high-speed rail, robotics, and so on, much in advance of what is available in the West. So the second area of control, contested at least, if not overwhelmed by what's happening in China. Number 3, control over financial systems. It's pretty clear with the emergence of the BRICS project that there are new financial systems being created. The new development bank in Shanghai, for instance, or the BRICS Bank, various other financial and credit providing bodies making their appearance, contesting the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so on. I'm not saying that in these 3, the West has been overwhelmed. It's just that it has faced a contest. The fourth area where there's no contest is information. Now, we'll have a webinar, some people will watch it and so on, but most of you will still get your news from either Western news sources or filtered through Western news sources. That if you even watch Indian news or you read the Indian newspapers, however progressive they are, most of them build their stories from Reuters, Associated Press, CNN, Fox News, and so on. This is globally, regardless of the language of the coverage. The international news stories, how the Israeli attack on Iran is being portrayed, largely will be Western refracted. One way or the other, it'll come through the West. Just see how the story about Xinjiang was brought into places like India. I mean, most people had no idea where Xinjiang was, let alone anything other than that. And then suddenly there was this talk of a Chinese genocide in Xinjiang, completely without context, without understanding what is happening. Based on the report produced how very rapidly the this report produced by a far right wing German guy who lives, within, or rather works within 15, 20 minutes of the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, how this one report suddenly went around the world, and people were beginning to say Xinjiang and genocide, one after the other. These terms became synonymous. How rapid that was. Meanwhile, here's a genocide happening against the Palestinians, and Western media just won't call it a genocide. They will say Palestinians killed in passive voice, and that gets repeated. Questions will be asked in the Indian media. What about Hamas? As if that excuses anything. What about Hamas and so on? The way in which the news stories are conveyed, the way in which stories are produced, and so on. There is no contest. RT from Russia just can't compete with the Western news outlets. CGTN, however many staff members it has, just can't compete with Western news outlets, and so on. This is something of concern. In 1980, the McBride report from the UN wrote very scathingly about the unevenness of the world media order. Satellites, more private satellites than public satellites. Elon Musk's Starlink owns more satellites than the Chinese government. Undersea cables, largely owned by private corporations. They control the hardware of information. So in terms of the fourth area of control, there isn't really much contest. The West and its corporations dominate the media environment and dominate the storyline. So that should be of some concern to people. The lack of global democratic media. We don't have the ability of small states, for instance, to convey their stories by themselves, which is why the global climate debate is so uneven. Small island states can't get their stories out about what's happening there. So, their ability to move an agenda to protect small island states is therefore very much curtailed as a consequence of the world uneven international media order. So in this fourth control, there's no contest. There is no contest. I mean, there may be other entities, Al Jazeera and so on the picture, but no contest really. The fifth area of control, weapons. Now, at Tricontinental, we published a report called Hyper-Imperialism, which I highly recommend you take a look at. In the report, what we found was, in doing a calculation of arms sales, real numbers, not imaginary numbers that are provided by governments, real numbers. What we found was that 83% or somewhere about over 80% of the share of world arms sales are within the global North countries, the NATO plus countries. We had calculated 73% for 2022, but it's increased since then to about 80%. Russia about 10%, China 4%, India much lower than that. I mean, these countries are simply not players when it comes to weapons industry. Now, what you're seeing now is impressive. The Iranians with Iranian-made weaponry able to strike Israel and demonstrating, just as the air war between India and Pakistan, that it's basically a draw between Israel and Iran. But if the United States enters the conflict, there is no draw. The US will obliterate Iran. And Iran is worried about that, very worried about that. And I know the US has said that they would perhaps come in. And maybe while we've been talking, they've decided to come in. But if they do, it's game over for Iran. The West dominates weapons. Nobody wants the United States to bomb them. Nobody. They've seen what it can do. I mean, they may not be able to govern countries, may not be able to come in and rule countries, but they can destroy countries. And that's of great concern to people around the world. So, to summarize the first part on the five controls, control over raw materials, control over science and technology, control over financial systems, contested. Certainly, no doubt about that. Control over information, not contested. Control over weapon systems, not contested. And therefore, on balance, I think we have to understand the world based on this methodology. It helps us a lot, I think. Okay? So that's part one. Just a second. Part two. Part two, three propositions. Okay? Three propositions. The first proposition, neoliberalism is dead. Long live neoliberalism. This was the slogan of monarchs. When a monarch died, you said, the king is dead, long live the king, because the king is an institution. And even if a physical king dies, another king is born. So the institution of kingship will continue. I'm trying to play with this, that even if certain neoliberal dispensation is over, another one is born. We are not post-neoliberal in any way, okay? Neoliberalism is dead, long live neoliberalism. Now, you see, what generally we argue in our institute is that it's true that neoliberalism and its technocrats exhausted themselves politically. For instance, the Blairite Labour Party, the Democratic Party in the United States of a certain kind, the Social Democrats of the Schroeder era, the technocrats in Italy and so on, they exhausted their political potential. This was somewhat the same in the global south, but not identical. It's really in the global north that one sees this more clearly, okay? Exhausted themselves and discovered that because they are facing a serious challenge from East Asia, from the rise of the Chinese economy in particular, that they need to, in a sense, discipline their labor further. To that end, sort of fascistic or neo-fascistic political formations have emerged. But these formations, Trump and so on, all accept the basic strictures of neoliberalism. They haven't junked neoliberalism. I mean, some policies here and there they don't like. They feel like they put too much pressure on people in their societies. But don't misunderstand their criticism of these. These are criticisms not against neoliberalism, but against the blanket racial bias rather the blanket racial non-bias of neoliberal policies. They would like, for instance, the right kind of women to have more children, the wrong kind of women not to have children, immigrants not to be welcome into the country. These are very racist forms of pronatalism, racist forms of anti-immigration, and so on. Their grasp of neoliberalism is to prevent a blanket neoliberalism and have a neoliberalism that, in fact, advantages whites even more in their societies. That's the general approach of the neo-fascists. Proposition number one, neoliberalism is dead, long live neoliberalism. The second proposition, unipolarity is dying, but not dead. And again, this should be clear from at least the control number 4 and 5, that it's impossible to say that unipolarity is dead. It's dying, but it's not yet dead. I mean, how can you consider the world not unipolar when only one set of powers are able to exercise without challenge a genocide against the population? I mean, what we are seeing is proof positive that it's premature to think about the death of unipolarity, but it's certainly dying. That's the second proposition. The third proposition is that the BRICS project is a commercial bloc that is being dragged into politics by reality. Now, after the third Great Depression starts in 2007, with the collapse of Western credit systems, many of the big countries in the global south basically looked around and said, listen, we can't keep relying on the United States to be the buyer of last resort. It's just not going to do it. Or we need to find other buyers, and maybe those other buyers have to be us. We have to sell to each other. So what we began to see was a greater push for South-South commercial interactions. The early BRICS meetings from 2009 onwards were largely commercial, discussions about how to increase less tariff trade between the BRICS countries and so on, how to, creating various customs unions and things like that, just to, encourage greater opportunities in markets in these large countries of the global south. That was the initial aspect of the BRICS. Subsequently, the BRICS has been dragged into politics. Initially, the big political question was UN reform. Having, say, Brazil have a Latin American seat at the UN Security Council, permanent seat, an African country, maybe South Africa or Nigeria, having a permanent seat. Neither Latin America nor Africa have permanent seats there. And then India, a large country, having a permanent seat. This was the kind of geometry of the politics of the BRICS. And then as history began to proceed, BRICS got more and more involved in political issues, preventing whole-scale condemnation of Russia for its war in Ukraine, making sure that the BRICS countries stayed in line and didn't support Israel when it came to the genocide against Palestinians. I mean, even India had to be much more cautious than perhaps Modi would have liked to have been on this issue. So the third proposition is BRICS is a commercial bloc, but it's being dragged into politics by reality. It's not being dragged into politics by program or by temperament. I mean, there are so many different class alignments within the BRICS that to think that be political unanimity is I think, is really quite, impossible. I mean, you have a communist party leading China and you have a right-wing party leading India. That itself shows you the coordinates of the BRICS. There is no political unanimity, but you see this common mood of saying the self-interest of these countries, why should they subordinate their interests to the United States and its allies and so on. That common mood is there. The new mood is there. But I don't want to exaggerate as well the intention and capacity of the BRICS project. Okay? So those are the three propositions. So far, we've had 5 controls and 3 propositions. Now we get to 2 dialectics. Dialectic number 1. Each dialectic obviously has 2 sides to it. So here's the first side. The first side is that, after the fall of the Soviet Union, global North countries celebrated this, thought that the world was theirs, and then began to do a couple of things. One is globalization, basically outsourced their manufacturing around the world, thinking it'll be protected by their control over intellectual property rights. And secondly, neoliberalism, which meant they hollowed out their own countries, allowed their millionaires to become billionaires, allowed them to go on tax strike, not investing in their countries, and so on. So the first part of dialectic number 1 is basically globalization and neoliberalism, taking place largely at the behest of the elites in the global north. The second part of this first dialectic is large global south states, mostly in Asia, absorbed the outsourced manufacturing and built infrastructure through the surplus generated by their productivity. I mean, they were able to increase their gross investment. They built infrastructure, they built manufacturing and so on. And that, of course, enabled them to have a dynamic growth profile as opposed to the global north, which began to grow at basically near zero rates. If you lift your growth sufficiently, you lift life expectancy. So quality of life improves in very many parts of Asia. BRICS and the BRI follow this growth profile. And so in the first dialectic, you have a dialectic between the kind of cannibalization taking place in the global north and a dynamism in the global south, and that dynamism becomes a threat. So that's the first dialectic, is that this dialectic between the effectively outsourcing and hollowing out of the north, and then this gross investment increasing in many global south countries led by China. Dialectic number two, um, from the north, from the countries led by the United States, as a consequence of their hold over the control over weapons and information, they move to impose conflict on the global south countries to prevent them from having this growth profile. So effectively, they want countries like China to surrender their growth profile, and to come back to being mainly labor for the global north. That's basically the drive from the global north countries. Their leadership comes to understanding that since there's a contest over raw materials, finance, science, and technology, they can't, by basic commercial means, compete with the global south. They can't force investment from their elites into their own countries. They can't force them to industrialize. It's much easier to use their advantage, which is weapon systems, to threaten countries in the south, to tell them to surrender their growth profiles and to say, well, it's about democracy, human rights. But really, it's not about democracy and human rights. It's about it's about the economic buoyancy of these parts of the world. And NATO is weaponized. Well, NATO is a military pact, but it's basically instrumentalized as global NATO to go and effectively break down the confidence that's there in the global south. So that's the first part of the second dialectic, the first side. The other side of that dialectic is the long history of decolonization that goes back to the revolutions of 1911 in Mexico, China, and Iran. The Majlis Revolution, the Republican Revolution, the revolution of Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata of 1911, which leads to the 1917 October Revolution. In 1913, Lenin writes a very interesting essay, short essay called Backward Europe, Advanced Asia, where he reflects on the Chinese Revolution of 1911, refers to the Majlis of 1911, doesn't really know much about Mexico, so doesn't talk about it. But that essay is interesting because it shows you how Lenin is understanding where the weakest links are. And the weakest links are in the colonized parts of the world, which includes the Tsarist Empire. People don't recognize. This is what I wrote about in Red Star over the Third World, that the Russian Revolution, 1917 revolution, was a revolution against the Tsarist Empire. It was also an anti-colonial national liberation revolution. It was not just a working class revolution, which it of course was. It was a revolution that starts with working women in St. Petersburg and so on. But it's also a revolution of the minority groups against the Tsarist Empire, which is really what shapes Lenin's understanding of national liberation and self-determination and so on. Okay, so the second part of the dialectic, of the second dialectic, is this vast, long process, historical process of decolonization starting over 100 years ago, that continues through the Vietnam Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, and onward. And this is a development that is for sovereignty and dignity, the sovereignty of states, the dignity of people. So it's got a very long history. It includes the Bandung Spirit, 1955, includes the Tricontinental Meeting of 1966. It includes all these things. It's a vast and important historical process which continues. It continues today in the Sahel region of Africa, where Ibrahim Traoré talks in the language of the 1911 revolutions and onward, that great period of decolonization. This dialectic is important because it, against the war or the hyper-imperialism of the global north, the other side of the dialectic, you have Xi Jinping of China talking about a shared future for humanity. You have, Jai Shankar of India saying we don't accept the NATO mindset. This is the other side of the dialectic, and I think we need to hit this side of the dialectic pretty hard. So there it is. There's my presentation. The 5 controls, where 3 of them are contested, 2 not: information and war making. 3 propositions: neoliberalism is dead, long live neoliberalism. Unipolarity is dying but not dead. BRICS is a commercial bloc dragged into politics. And then the 2 dialectics. The first one, essentially giving you an understanding of how we got to the situation of the dynamism of the global South and the new Cold War imposed by the global North. And then the second dialectic is on the hyper-imperialism of the global North, demanding a Southern surrender, and the South turning around and saying, no, we want to produce a shared future for humanity. That's the new mood in the global South, by numbers. 5, 3, 2. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Comrade. I think one thing that I will definitely take away from this lecture of yours is how to break down very seemingly complex concepts into this easily digestible framework. So at least on BRICS and neocolonialism, 5 controls, 3 propositions, 2 dialectics makes it that much easier to understand and take forward in our politics as well, hopefully. So there's a few questions that we have received in the comments, but I think I can use moderator's privilege and put mine in at the top. You had mentioned the New Development Bank towards the beginning of your comments. So I think most of us here, if we have taken a look at the 1987, this famous speech of Thomas Sankaras, where he says, debt is neocolonialism. I wanted to ask you, Comrade, how far do you think institutions like the New Development Bank enable genuine sort of developmental structural transformation in the Global South in a manner that is very different from the so-called structural adjustments of the IMF and the World Bank? So that is question number 1. Perhaps we can take a few of them together and then you can, yeah. So we have Comrade Tunir Adhikari, who has asked, why should the working class of the Global South support the BRICS project? Does it have their interests at heart, or does it only signify the desires of the national bourgeoisie? So that's one question. We have Comrade Al-Aziz Hussain, who has said, India has differed from other BRICS members, especially in its stance on the war in Palestine and attacks on Iran. Will this impact its role and influence within the BRICS grouping? And we have Nabarun, who has said, your views on how to tackle right-wing populism surge all across the world. How can we actually combat its increasing influence? Yeah, so we'll leave it at that. Comrade Vijay will also have to wind up his session quite soon. Yeah, so Comrade Vijay, over to you.
Yeah, let's just go right down the list, because these are all good questions. The first one is the character of the money. Yeah, I mean, obviously all money is the same in one way, but credit comes with conditions always, and one shouldn't just look at the credit but at the conditions. Yeah, that's important. So IMF money, International Monetary Fund money, generally comes with the condition that the Western bondholder is inviolable, and payment to them must be a priority. So that if I give you money through an IMF program, the first person in the queue is the bondholder before everything else. Yeah, that's the condition of the money. Interestingly, New Development Bank, People's Bank of China, all these other avenues of financing have reversed the equation. Effectively, they say, and you can read the agreements. It's a lot of it is publicly available. Now it's publicly available. They say that, look, we'll give you money, but it's for infrastructure and industry. So a lot of Belt and Road project money cannot be used for debt servicing. In that sense, the character of the money is different. It is earmarked for either infrastructure or industry. That's to me quite interesting. It's the first time in a very long time that we are seeing earmarked money coming from international institutions for infrastructure and industry. So, in that sense, I find it pretty interesting. The second question on what should the working class do? So, the first thing is it's not a question of what should or shouldn't the working class do. My presentation was mostly what's happening. You know, as Marx and Engels write in the German ideology, um, communism is not something you impose on the world. It's the actual movement of history. So we have to actually assess what is the movement of history, and nobody can tell you the actual movement. We all approximate, that's analysis. We approximate the movement of history. This is my approach to it. Now, I'm not making a proposition of strategy that therefore in this case XYZ should do that. I think that's a question of political organizations making a determination, given if this interpretation of the actual movement of history is accurate or not. How should a Kisan movement, operate? How should a trade union operate, and so on? In some cases, working class, unions in some sectors may decide that, look, the BRICS project is beneficial to us as workers in this sector because, we are pivoting from producing for the US market and producing for the Brazilian and South African market through the BRICS channels. We are a pharmaceutical company and so on. So the BRICS project is beneficial for us as workers in this sector. That's a very narrow trade union perspective, what Lenin might have called an economistic perspective. A broader perspective, socialist perspective, would have to say, well, look, you can't build socialism in a country like India out of poverty. You've got to build the productive forces. What is going to enable the productive forces to be built? It's certainly not IMF loans. That hasn't worked at all. Is it going to be the New Development Bank? Is it going to be through state intervention in certain sectors? Is it going to be through the creation of constructive markets at the local level? For instance, what they do in several countries, Vietnam and so on, constructive markets at the local level, get state, small scale state firms to compete with each other, create competition within the state sector, and so on. Is that the way forward? These are political discussions. So you're asking a very broad question. Should the working class support the BRICS project? I don't think you can answer a question like that at a completely disaggregated scale. You have to break it down. What are we talking about? Are we talking about a communist party? I mean, what's the point of making a political judgment on the BRICS project unless we accurately understand it, is what I would say. So my attempt here was just to provide an interpretation, which I think is pretty accurate because I've made the presentation. Others may not agree. But based on that, it will take a different kind of discussion, whether and how and when one decides to, what will be the stance regarding the BRICS project overall. Okay, so I don't think you can have a general position. I think the strategy would have to be, is the BRICS useful to advance a democratization of the world order? And based on that, what will be the tactical maneuvers? I think would be quite interesting. So I would leave it at that, okay? India. Well, the fact is that India has, not been able to follow a complete BJP position on these many of these issues, on Palestine even, but certainly on Russia. India hasn't condemned Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. In fact, India's position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine is less critical than China. China was more critical. In fact, China criticized Russia for invading Ukraine in February, March 2022. China criticized Russia. India didn't criticize Russia. It's interesting. So India's position is modulated by the self-interest of the Indian government, of the Indian elites, and so on. So I wouldn't be too quick to assume that there's a straight line between the BJP positions or historical position and this government position. I mean, they have a problem. They can't afford, for instance, to just stop all Russian oil, because then you'll have mass starvation on your hands. No government can tolerate that. You'll be wiped out in the Bihar election and so on. So you got to keep allowing discounted oil from Russia to enter India. So on that, there is a kind of the contradictions in the world modulate the extremism of BJP politics, I would argue. Um, far more far more concerning than the situation. India's position on Palestine or on Russia is the Indian government's position on Kashmir. That's far more concerning, because there is fiat, carte blanche to do whatever. It's far more concerning. Right wing populism. I mean, this was not exactly the theme of what I was talking about, but I did say in the neoliberalism is dead, long live neoliberalism, that the new forces of the right, the far right of a special type, and so on, have emerged largely on the detritus of neoliberal technocratic politics. But their political assessment is basically still neoliberal with a kind of racial character, is what I'd argued. How do you fight this? I mean, you fight this by building new kinds of mass struggles. I mean, that's the only way. You have to build new kinds of mass struggles. That there is no other way to defeat the right wing. There's just no other way. You have to um, build new kinds of mass struggles. I mean, I've been recently going back and reading, I don't know where it is, Togliatti's lectures on fascism. Tremendous, statements he makes about how to defeat these forms of the right, and he comes up with interesting ideas. So yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a cliched answer. I'm sorry, but that's all I have.
Thank you so much, comrade. I think that's our time for today. And on behalf of the Students' Federation of India Central Executive Committee, I would like to thank very sincerely Comrade Vijay for having taken the time to do this online lecture for us. Comrade Vijay, before you leave, would you like to say two words for our upcoming 18th All India conference as well? We can't hear you, sorry.
I very much hope that the SFI has an excellent Congress and comes out of your conference deliberations stronger, more determined to defend public education. I think that's the primary issue, to improve conditions for students. I mean, conditions for students have to be improved. You got to have better access to libraries, better quality things. I'll tell you something funny, Nikhil. I'm writing a little book about some of my family members. In 1928, my grandfather wrote a letter to Nature magazine in 1928 saying that nature, we in the colonies don't have access to journals because you have a colonial attitude to journal pricing. And we can't keep up with the leading things of science. That was in 1928. Okay. We'll be coming up to the 100th anniversary of that letter. Yeah, it applies today. Students today don't have access to journals, don't have access to materials. This is a matter of the working and living conditions of students. So I hope from there you go all the way out to the defense of the Palestinians, starting with the self-interest of students, all the way out to the self-interest of humanity. Congratulations for the life of the SFI, and I hope you have as many years and more to come.
Thank you so much, Comrade. Comrade Vijay Prashad, everyone, and thanks to Comrade Shantanu who did all the social media backwork as well. Yeah, that's it for today, everyone.
Okay,
Thank you. Bye bye.
bye. Bye.